Yes, Mary.
Yes, Mary.
Great, thank you. So today's session is an overview of open educational resources, and so I am going to give you an overview of firstly kind of what they are and the kind of current status of them in the world generally, but then also just looking at some current projects that are being led by CAUL, which is the Council of Australian University Librarians. So there's some big projects going on in this arena, and it's a really interesting one for educators. So I'm looking forward to getting started. And I do want to say too, please feel free to either put up your hand or just ask a question at any point. You will obviously get the opportunity at the end of the session, but I'm more than happy if something is unclear for you to dive in at any point. That's fine. Or if you're just curious about something, it doesn't have to be unclear, but please just don't mind interrupting me. I don't mind that at all. So as you can see, this is a topic of today's session. Oops, sorry. And again, just a formal acknowledgement of the country. I'm joining you from Wadawurrung country today. This is the Fed Uni general slide, but just from Wadawurrung country today. And I would imagine that we have a range of countries across Australia that we're joining from today. So if you would like to take a moment to acknowledge that, please feel free to do so in the chat or just to yourself, that's fine. Okay, sorry, get my on the right thing. So as I said, I'm just going to give you an introduction to the open educational resources, what they are. We call them OERs for short, obviously, because it's a much easier way of referring to the whole area of content and practice. And I'll just touch briefly on the Federation OER guide, because that's something that you can always look at yourselves. There's a lot out there, but ours is a pretty good sort of general introductory guide, and I'll talk about those projects and then also what might be next on the horizon. So I guess I'd like to start just by giving an overview of what OER actually are, and I'm aware that there may be a range of familiarity within this group. So does anybody want to tell me if they know much about them or they know nothing about them? Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any indication? Oh, thanks, Luke and Christine, that's lovely. Do you have any sense of your knowledge in relation to OER that you'd like to share with me?
Yeah. Hi, it's Luke here. I am pretty familiar with OERs. I've been doing a bunch of research over the last few months about them, and I've been pushing for more digital content to be prescribed by our academics at MIT, specifically within the MIT programs, rather than Fed. But we have had a little bit of uptake there, especially using textbooks from OpenStax. So
fantastic.
I've been developing a digital content strategy, and that's been ratified by our teaching and learning committee.
Oh, fantastic. That's great, Luke. So your practice is reasonably mature. That's good.
I still early days, but it's we're not starting from nothing.
No, you're not. That's great. Jenny?
I do know of open education resources. I've also done an earlier course about open license and what the benefits are. My last job before here, I was trying to get it into for safe, much cheaper for the students to get access to the open license. I haven't really had a talk with ATMC about them, but they're great. They're fantastic.
Oh, that's good. That's great. Any other comments from the group? Nope. So I'm guessing that there is, like I mentioned, a range of experience and knowledge within the group. So Luke and Jenny, you'll just have to bear with me, please, while I go over the basics of what OERs and the licensing are. And feel free to jump in if you think that if there's anything you'd like to add at any point. Basics are always good. Thanks, Luke. Okay, OERs or open educational resources. They're learning, teaching and research materials in any format and medium that reside in the public domain. And I'm hoping that you all know what public domain is. It basically means that there is no licensing associated with those materials, or they're under copyright. And so whether or not they're in the public domain or under copyright is very much dependent on the copyright law that exists in the country in which the material was created. So as you know, in Australia, things tend to go out of copyright after a certain amount of time. It's usually about 70 years or after the death of the author. So every year new items get released into the public domain unless the copyright is somehow reapplied, which does happen sometimes. So, oh, thank you, Jenny. So what these resources are, though, they've actively been released under an open license. So this is a license that supersedes the copyright law within the country of origin, and generally they permit no cost access, permit reuse, the ability to repurpose, adapt and redistribute to others. I'll go into this in a bit more detail. One of the things that I wanted to mention here in relation to OERs is that they are seen as a plank in Unesco's Sustainable Development Goals, which libraries and higher education institutions generally are very supportive of. In fact, we're now universities being measured on them as part of various international rankings these days. So these are the goals that they're regarded as contributing to. So, and they tend to relate to things like quality of education, equality or equity of access, innovation, and the ability for developing countries to contribute to research and learning, reducing inequalities, public access to information, and protecting freedoms and partnerships for the goals. So, because often OERs are created in partnership or used in partnership with other people. And so this, the development of the SDGs has given a bit of a push to and highlighted OERs internationally. I know that they've been around for a few years, but that strong connection has really helped, I think, bring them to people's attention around the world. Okay, oops, sorry, just get my mouse on the right page. Okay, so when I talk about open licensing, I've already mentioned that open licensing supersedes copyright law in the sense that whoever actually owns the intellectual property of the particular item that is being licensed, while it respects the intellectual property rights of that copyright owner, it enables them to provide permissions that grant other people the rights to, as it says here, access, reuse, repurpose, adapt and redistribute educational materials. And it provides that right without having to individually contact the copyright owner to ask for permission or for payment of generally. So applied, and it can be interpreted without actually having to contact whoever's created the item. And I've put in here just that Creative Commons symbol, because Creative Commons licenses are the most common form of open license used for OER. They've been around for 20 years now. I've been in the industry long enough to know when they were first a thing, and everybody in the library industry was very excited about the development of these Creative Commons licenses, and very kind of open to the possibilities of the use within our sector. And it's not just universities, it's in a range of teaching and learning settings, which is pretty much every library. It started out with, I think, about 3 licenses, and they've evolved now to include 6 different formal Creative Commons licenses and something that's called a public domain dedication, which is a CC0 license. So that CC there is a 0, it's not an O, and that just basically means that there is absolutely no obligation to do anything in relation to acknowledging the copyright owner or the licensee of that particular work. So someone can create something and immediately give it a public domain license, so they don't even need to be acknowledged as the creator of that work, as I mentioned there. So all of these materials can be used for educational purposes. That's because they're non-commercial. So I'll get into that in more detail. So even though we do work in commercial industries, in the sense that we might work for private providers or for, in the case of a government-run higher education institutions, we are still regarded as an educational setting and the educational copyright provisions apply. So we're regarded as non-commercial in that sense. If you want to have a bit of a play and look at the licenses, there's a link here to the Creative Commons license chooser, which is good fun to play with, but I'm going to go over them in a little bit more detail. Anyway, so this is what they look like. These are the 6 licenses that are currently available, and I've put a link in there again to the website that contains these licenses, and they're listed there in terms of from the least restrictive in terms of how you can use them to the most restrictive. And again, I'll just go into a little bit more detail, but there's a bunch of symbols that all mean things, and I'll show you what they mean in just a moment. So the first one, this person symbol, and you get how it means there's a person, it's an attribution, Creative Commons by license. And so all that means in practice is that this is the basic license that is applied to all works under Creative Commons license, and it really just means that you must attribute or acknowledge the creator of that work when you use it in your own work. That's all the attribution means. So it's a bit like referencing, just making sure that you acknowledge who the creator was. So as you can see, that attribution is part of all of the licenses, and it's listed here. And so there's a few other symbols that are there. So the next one here is non-commercial use. So there are plenty of people who will license their materials for non-commercial use. So it might be just for educational purposes or for someone's own creativity. It might be, but the minute people are starting to make money from the particular work, then they're not permitted to use that work anymore. And of course, it's really up to the individual to acknowledge and respect that license. It can be difficult to enforce unless someone makes a lot of money and is high profile and you discover that they've made money out of using your work that you've licensed under this. But it is all about being ethical, I think, and respecting that. And you can see from the way they're listed here, the non-commercial applies to 3 of the licenses that are there, and they're at the more restrictive of the end of the spectrum.
Good.
So the other one here, this equal symbol, is no derivative works. That this just means that you must use the resource, the item, whatever it is, in the form in which it has already been produced. So if someone has created a video and it's 5 minutes and you want to use it as part of your own learning and teaching, for example, you have to use it as it is. You're not allowed to cut it up or slice it up or change it in any way. They don't want you they want you to maintain the integrity of that resource regardless of your own individual preference. So again, this comes back to the ethics and respecting that the integrity of that resource is maintained. And again, you can see this is only applies to a couple of the licenses. So one where you're supposed to attribute but you're not allowed to make derivative works, and one where you're supposed to attribute, but you're not allowed to make derivative works and you're not allowed to use it commercially, and that's the most restrictive of all the licenses that are available. And then the final one, this sort of remix symbol, is share alike. So this one allows others to remix, adapt, build, and work, but only if they distribute the derivative works under the same license terms that govern the original work. So it just means that if you are going to create a new artifact and the artifact has had, say, this license applied to it, so you must attribute and share alike that if you create something and then republish it, you must apply the same licensing to that as the original item that you used in part of creating your own works. So again, the share alike combined with the non-commercial is looking at the more restrictive end of things, but it's one of the least restrictive when it's not used in that commercial setting. One important thing to note is that a license can't feature both the share alike and no derivative works options, because you can't apply that if you haven't been able to make works, if that makes sense. So they can't exist in the same licensing sphere because they're contradictory to each other. Does that all make sense? Do you have any questions about the components of the Creative Commons licenses? Nope, I'll take that as a no then. Okay, so handily, there is a little cheat sheet that sort of summarizes all this information. And again, I've put the URL here for this particular graphic, and it shows, again, all of the licenses from freest to most restrictive, and then it tells you really clearly what you can actually do under the terms of each of those licenses. So it's a really handy kind of graphic to have if you're unsure about what they all mean and what you can do. Because really, you don't always need to know what these things actually stand for. Often you're just looking for, well, what can I do with this? And this will actually tell you how you can use things. Okay, so in terms of OERs, and I should have probably said at the outset, I've just realised, when we're talking about open educational resources, this really refers to absolutely anything that can be used in an education setting. So it could be written content, it could be a still image, it could be a video. In some settings it can be software, but software tends to have slightly different licensing provisions, so I'm not really going to talk about those today. But anything that could be used for education in an educational setting. It could be a simulation, something that, say, shows what happens when you mix two chemicals in a laboratory setting, that sort of thing. So it really can be anything that could be used as a curriculum resource. But this particular piece of information is taken from our Federation OER guide, and it's it's a commonly used sort of piece of text which shows how the Creative Commons licenses allow these 5 main activities, which are known as the 5 OERs, to be used within the setting. So those licenses, the purpose of them, all of these, the purpose of applying these licenses and having people be able to use materials that have these licenses applied is really clearly articulated by the 5 OERs, which are these rights that are permitted. So the first one is to retain, and it's really important, this one, because it does retain, does give creators the right to make, own and control a copy of a resource. So it means that you can download and keep your own copy of a material. We all know that when people are using internet resources, for example, it is still really common for people to just take an image and download it and use it, even regardless of the license. But this particular license means that you're doing that both legally and I guess ethically in relation to that particular work. And then revise. So this is a really important one, particularly in the educational setting, because it does give you permission to edit, adapt and modify your copy of the resource. So it means that you can, as it says here, translate it into another language, or you can change a section of it to localize it to your particular national setting, for example. So if you get a resource that comes from the United States, you might need to change some of the legal terminology, for example, for an Australian setting. And that's really common in our institutions, that we need the particular legalities to comply with our own national laws and ways of teaching and adherence to accreditation standards, etc. So that's a really important one. The other one is remixing. So, and this is different to revision in the sense that it's combining your either the original copy that you had, this one under that you've retained, or your revised version. So you're able to then combine it with something entirely different to create something that's quite new and quite different to the original material that was prepared. And this is, you know, best exemplar by a mashup. So you might have, say in music, someone that just samples a track from someone else who's Creative Commons licensed some of their music. They've incorporated, you know, even just 5 seconds of it into their own particular resource, and then they've created, you know, what we commonly know as a mashup. But the same could apply for video or for all kinds of things, you know, a really extensive change to a textbook, for example. The other R that's there is reuse. So you're allowed to use that original, this one here, either the original one that you've retained, sorry, the one that the version that you've revised, or the version that you've remixed, you're allowed to use that publicly. So whether that's out there in the world in terms of a website or being emailed to other people, or in a more closed setting like that's behind a firewall or a login like the learning management system such as Moodle. But the main thing that is really valuable for the whole OER community is this last one, which is redistribution. So that gives people permission to share copies of both the original version that they might have retained and kept for themselves, the revised or remixed version. They can actually post a copy online. And it's when this redistribution, or what you might think of as republication, is where the licensing and things like the share alike factor is important. So whenever you do something and you are redistributing and you've used something that does have a share alike license, you have to comply with the original licensing provision. So that's where that sort of consideration needs to come in. So any questions again about those 5 R's? Okay, I'll move on then. Okay, so now we're at the why, and there's lots of whys about using OERs in a tertiary setting, but they mostly come down to 2 things. Or 2 domains. So there's the aspect for the academics or the people who are developing and preparing curriculum. They might be teachers, they might be learning designers, but there's also the student perspective. So I think, Luke, you touched on before about reducing costs for students. Oh, so did you, Jenny. So the best thing about OERs is that they are free. And so they're freely available on the internet from a range of sources, some of which I'll show you later. And so it means that both for institutional budgets, so like for libraries, for example, they're obtainable at no cost. And many of them, even though they're born digital, because I should mention too actually that OERs are always born digital. This is what enables their reuse to be so freely able to occur, is that they start out as digital artifacts, and it's, I guess, one of the boons of the modern world that we're in. So yeah, even though they might be able to be printed and put it on a shelf in a library or printed by a student, they're born digital, so they can be used digitally or printed or created if it's appropriate in the case of the format of whatever is being used. But the other thing is that because they're born digital, with the increasing emphasis on online teaching, they're really suitable to online learning and online curriculum development. But from an academic's perspective, they do provide opportunities for collaboration and innovation in developing curriculum resources. So that could be collaboration with peers in your particular field. So you might work with, I might be a like I said before, a chemistry academic, and I want to, rather than getting everybody in the lab and mixing some unsafe chemicals, I just want to create a simulation of a particular experiment, or I want to video it. And so that can be done collaboratively and then used by a range of academics in the same discipline around the world. And in terms of innovation, I guess it can really help people to rethink how they might teach as well. So like I say, so instead of getting all these students in a lab, which can be both expensive and time consuming and dangerous to do, you can do something digitally, show what happens, and then talk it through, say, your teaching group online. One of the key and that really then goes into this kind of, I guess, the sense of aligning with modern learning and teaching practices. So just being much more online and innovative in the way we're preparing resources. One of the other key points is this, which is improved student success and retention through removal of barriers to access. So it can just be time spent on campus, or the expense of travelling to campus to attend a session that could be done in a different way. But one of the main things is just really providing a level playing field. So if you've got people with different abilities in the classroom, for example, the digital resources are much more readily adaptable to enable all abilities to be able to participate in terms of how that resource could be adapted to individual needs. And I've talked here about increased efficiency through ready availability and adaptability. And that's particularly important because, historically, if someone was writing, say, a textbook on psychology, and they were a traditional academic and they wanted to create an Australian version of a foundational psychology textbook, if they wanted to reuse parts of other people's work, whether it's journal articles or other books, textbooks or otherwise, they would have to go through a really lengthy process of obtaining permission to do that from the original publishers and copyright owners, who are generally big publishers, and they will just about invariably charge, even if it's a token amount, they would charge for reuse of their existing materials, and it's often a very time-consuming and laborious process. I know this from people who have gone through it, academics who've gone through that, and also for people who are trying to publish, say, from their PhD, and they haven't had to seek permission to publish to complete their PhD, but then they do to have to public in order to publish from it. Whereas your OERs, they're out there, they're available, you know what the licensing provision is, you don't have to spend any time going through and working out what's possible. You can just get on with it and adapt. And because they're born digital, you can work with anybody anywhere around the world, provided they've got a decent internet connection, on adapting the resources. I touched before about the reduced education costs for students and libraries. So I think particularly for the students, I mean, libraries generally have reasonable budgets and will tend to focus on acquiring textbooks, at least to the minimum that's needed. But the research has shown that the real benefit is for the students themselves, because there's a lot of research that shows that students will, in many instances, particularly if they're of less advantaged socioeconomic brackets, will forego textbook purchases just because they need to prioritise things like putting petrol in their car or eating, or they've had unexpected costs in another area of their life, like health costs, or been unable to work for whatever reason. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that students either A, will not buy the textbook unless they feel like they absolutely have to, or if they are set a textbook that is then only used minimally, like a chapter or two, they really resent having paid the money to purchase that book. The other thing is that publishers so frequently change editions, even if it's a minor change, that the resale market for textbooks is all but minimal, is just about disappeared these days as well. One of the other issues that's cropped up in recent years too is that students may be able to buy an e-textbook that is not actually available to the library to purchase. We might only be able to purchase the previous edition, or if we can purchase the textbook, we can't license all of the learning and curriculum resources that are often scaffolded around the textbook. And so if that's used in teaching, then that can be a problem as well. So really just trying to remove that that cost for students has been a really big motivator for a lot of people to get into this field. And it does mean that particularly one of the comments of thanks, Luke, for that comment. So in your experience at MIT, our students, mostly Indian and Nepalese, are not used to relying on textbooks for learning, and they don't understand the importance of having one. Yeah, because they've come from a background that doesn't rely on them. And it ties into actually what I was just about to say, is that one of the key motivators of the uptake in OERs around the world is that is partly the background and the socioeconomic circumstances of the particular country. So the practice is quite mature in countries like Africa, some of the African nations, and also in the US, where governments are required to provide the resources themselves. So students don't actually have to buy them, or they pay for the resources as part of their education fees. So it's rolled into their costs for attending higher education. So there's been a really big, I guess, point of difference motivator for particular either college systems or state systems in the US to reduce those costs for students and say, hey, we're not actually requiring you to pay this particular fee because we're using free resources. So it's a point of difference for us if we've got a reduced fee for similar education because we're using different resources. Because one of the areas that's particularly not advanced in the use of OERs is Europe, and it surprises people given the level of higher education. They're coming from a different tradition though, where the textbook is kind of part of learning, which is the tradition that we've inherited, where students do bear some of the costs for purchasing textbooks. And while many institutions try and ameliorate that through scholarships and bursaries and all kinds of things, it's still seen as a really great way of just not having to put that burden on students. Another key item that I just wanted to touch on was the assistance with compliance with the Higher Education Standards Framework, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's the framework produced by TEXA, our accrediting agency, the national one, and they specify only to a fairly broad degree about what kinds of learning resources can be used, and they talk a lot about using what's appropriate and relevant and of sufficient quality. But one of the things that they stipulate really clearly, which is relevant to the library setting, is that the learning resources must be accessible by all students regardless of mode of delivery or location. And as libraries, we interpret that as, well, we will provide access, whether through having a couple of copies of a print item in our collections or providing online resources. And where publishing has shifted to maintain their income stream by moving to e-textbooks, they've cut us out from being able to as readily comply with this component of the standard by, as I said before, only allowing library access to either an older edition or to only part of the actual books and not all the scaffolded material that comes with it and is often used as part of the curriculum. So I've just put the URL here again if you want to investigate that a bit further, but it really assists us in the higher education setting to really comply with the specifications of that higher education standards framework domain 3.3. Okay, so where do you find the OERs? So I'll only touch on this briefly, but most OER content is locatable through meta finders, search engines, directories, and there's some examples here. If you look on our, as in the Fed LibGuide, there's quite a list, and there's discipline-based lists if you want to look at it. So again, that URL is just here, or you could probably search for it. But yeah, please have an explore. Some of them have been around for a really long time, like MIT courseware. The Open Textbook Library is a great way to find existing textbooks. Some of them will be Australian, and the OER Commons is great for looking at a really broad range of OER types of resources. And a lot of one thing that a lot of people don't know is that you can also just use Google Advanced Search, just using setting the usage rights parameters to this particular, so they've basically summarized the Creative Commons licensing, so it's free to use, share or modify. So it's a really nice broad interpretation of some of the Creative Commons licensing. So yes, so that's one way to find them as well. Although these days the directories and meta finders are better probably than using Google Advanced Search, because there's a lot of curating that goes on. And Luke, yes, you can plug your guide here, of course, go for it. So MIT has a guide too. Feel free to chuck the link in the chat, that would be great. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Luke, because there are a lot of libraries do produce guides, and I think that we can all learn a lot from each other's resources and how they're developed and how they're focused. So thanks, Luke, that's great. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on OER activity in Australian universities, and there's really quite a range. So of the 39 universities, and that includes, you know, the publicly funded ones as well as the private ones, there's probably only a handful that I would describe as having a reasonably mature practice. And notable among them are Deakin University in Victoria, and RMIT is kind of getting there. But the University of Southern Queensland has probably been the leader within Australia. And so libraries, particularly the larger libraries with a range of guides, a large range of staff roles, have dedicated roles like the Open Education Librarian at Deakin and the Manager of Open Education Practice. I'm not really touching on Open Education Practice in this session, but just to note that this title has evolved in the last, I guess I'd say probably 5 years, to encompass open pedagogy. So it's really looking at how open education resources can be used in a pedagogical setting, and to encompass things like open assessments. Again, not going into that, but it is a whole other field, sort of stretch field of learning for people. So how you can have your students complete assessments that can then be put out into the world and remixed and reused by, say, the next intake of students, for example. That's probably one of the clearest examples. There's a lot of institutions that are starting to advocate for OER adoption and mandates. There aren't many yet that are publishing open textbooks, but I'll touch on that when I get to the call part of the session. But most are now creating self-help resources such as the Federation Subject Guide, which I've already touched on a few times. So, and like your guide, Luke. So as a bare minimum, that's often what libraries have, is some way of helping academics find them. Okay, so the Call OER projects. So they're part of a program called Enabling a Modern Curriculum through Open Educational Resources. This entire program encompasses 5 projects. So the 3 really specifically related to OERs that are listed here, as well as a Students as Partners project and a conference implementation project. You can subscribe to the program blog for updates, and it's not just about updates on the projects. It's really updates and tips and sessions on the whole practice of open education. So it's much broader than the particular projects, and I suspect will have a life beyond the life of the particular projects. So I'm just going to talk about these 3 today. And so the first one is the Open Education Resources Collective, which is basically a group that is being put together to enable a range of higher education institutions who are mostly fairly new to OERs, to make a start with open publishing through access to a shared platform. So the goal of this is to publish open textbooks, and it is just open textbooks, and to allow people who don't have a lot of experience or can't afford to purchase the infrastructure to purchase and participate in quality infrastructure. So Call has purchased an instance, so a license to Pressbooks, which is an open textbook publication platform, which a couple of institutions have their own version of. RMIT is one, I think University of Southern Queensland is another. But it is an expensive thing to invest in, so a lot of institutions can't afford to do that. But what Call has done is enabled people to buy just one textbook in that suite, so they can buy into creating one particular textbook. So what they've done for this year is they've signed up their maximum number of institutions, 30 of them, including Federation, have signed up, and they've created a community of practice around that and held some events for training. I think when I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, one event had been held because we delayed due to me being unwell last week. I think now 2 have been held. So they've gone a bit further. But one of the main things that they've done, and which I'd encourage you to have a look at, is that they've developed a publishing workflow, which is online, and it's just done in LibGuides, and it's a really comprehensive guide to publishing. I'm not going to go over all of it. This is basically just the landing page, but it really just guides everybody through how you start publishing an open textbooks. It says this is specifically designed for Pressbooks. There are other resources that could be used, but this is the rest of the process is really applicable regardless of whichever publishing platform is being used. Okay, so the second project that I'm going to talk about is the Professional Development Program, and this is the project that I'm the lead for. And we've had 2 very clear objectives, one to develop a proposal for an open education resource professional development program, and then develop and implement said program. And so the proposal itself has taken probably, I would say, about 8 months of work, because we've done a lot of research into what's already out there, the sorts of resources that can be used, what needs to be adapted or created for an Australian higher ed setting, etc. But we've got the green light to go ahead and fully implement and deliver that program, which will be launched in September this year. So we're at the moment, we're developing the program, which basically at this stage, this is what we're doing for this year. So we're delivering foundation modules, so introducing people to what OERs are, looking at open licensing and how it dovetails with copyright, particularly any particular institutional policies or mandates that might need to be explored within each institutional setting. So there's a few layers of nuance to explore there. Then how you find them, and like with any resource, it's classic librarian work. You need to evaluate OERs, and evaluating OERs is a little different to evaluating other resources, because you really do have to consider the licensing, what you can do with it, and whether it's appropriate to the particular curriculum setting, rather than being used, say, for an assessment task. And then looking at how you adapt and create your own OER. So when you might just find something and think it's usable, you basically, what we think of as just adopting it, you're just using it as is and rolling it into your curriculum. The most common approach to using OERs is in this adaptation space though. So that's where you might need some knowledge of particular software programs, or be able to really clearly identify what the adaptations might be. Creating OERs from scratch is a bigger body of work, so we're only touching on that briefly, and we'd probably only look at things that are fairly simple for people to create, like something short text-based online, or a video, for example, rather than an entire textbook. But what we are doing is building in this OER in practice module as an underpinning module across the foundation. So right from the start, participants will be working on a project to apply within their own institution, and that might be being involved in the textbook collective. It might be about advocacy within their own institutions. It might be doing the kind of work Luke is doing, creating a guide and talking to academics about how they can build OERs into their practice. As I mentioned before, open education pedagogy is a more advanced sort of sphere of knowledge, and so we're looking at doing some advanced modules next year, including higher level advocacy and engagement, so more institutional wide, not necessarily the sort of lower levels of influence, which leads into the final project, which is the Oer Advocacy Project. And this group has been tasked with developing an advocacy toolkit to support practitioners and institutions in their OER work. So they're developing a website that can be used for people to adapt and use within their own institution, so a range of resources that can be used within your own setting, and including some mapping of what's already going on out there, so people can easily connect with either experts or other or copy good practice that's going on in other institutions. And they'll be delivering some planning workshops at the call conference, which I'll touch on very briefly in just a moment. So participants in these workshops will start to develop an advocacy plan for within their own institution. And that kind of advocacy plan could then be used as part of the PD program that is being run as well. So just quickly, this is the call conference. So this is an online conference being run on the 7th and 8th of September with some face-to-face workshops in the 5 key capital cities here, sorry, to Darwin and Hobart, of course, and they're on the 13th of September. So I've put the link in there. It is slightly cheaper for call institution members to attend this conference. I think it starts at about $55 for online and maybe $70 for the workshops. For call non-member institutions, it's about $75 for online and possibly a little bit more for the workshops, I'm not sure, but feel free to check out the website if you've got any interest in that. I suspect that some of the content will probably be made freely available after the conference has been run. I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that if that doesn't eventuate. It's just been talked about. And I just wanted to point out some really recent research that was published just this year. This publication from a couple of academics at Deakin who were funded by the National Centre for, I forget what this is, it's Equity in Higher Education. I'm forgetting what the S stands for, but they really do a lot of research into improving equity within higher education. And this very recent research talked about the adoption of open textbooks and how it impacts on social justice, with some particular recommendations for institutions to help the adoption of open education practices. So they looked at what has been effective in institutions where the practice is reasonably mature, and then made some recommendations about how to develop the practice across the organisations. Again, I won't, I'm running out of time, so I won't say much more, but that publication is well worth a look at if you're looking in your own context. So I guess, yeah, with a few minutes to go, I just wanted to finish by asking, is there anything you would like to learn more about, and do you think there's anything you can do within your own institution, either starting off practices or adding to your current practice? Oh, thanks, Luke, for popping that in there, the link in the chat. That's great. And or do you have any questions? Stunned silence.
Thanks for that, Marion. Was that Jenny?
It was.
Yeah, you go first. I'll put my hand up. I'll go next.
Oh, sorry.
Great.
Should have raised my
Thanks,
hand.
Jenny. No, that's all right. Go for it, Luke. Thanks, Jenny.
I just want to, not a question, but just a comment about some of the trouble that I've had here in advocating for OERs. The academics are, in general, really reluctant to adapt or adopt any resource here that doesn't come with lecture slides and question banks and all of the other instructor resources that publishers provide. And they really use textbooks as a crutch, as for their curriculum design, basically. So that's one of the conversations that we've had to have a lot, sort of face-to-face individually with teaching staff who are interested in adopting a more flexible approach. There are a couple of staff here who do design their own curriculums and have really taken up not the OER stuff necessarily, but we've kind of gone back to the old school chapter by chapter reader that we used to have, but delivering those digitally via our copyright agency platform, Flex. So we're doing basically that, as well as some OER content. There's a couple of subjects that have picked up OERs and have prescribed those, which is great. But yeah, it's the curriculum design and the instructor resources that are really stumbling blocks that we've experienced so far.
Thanks, Luke, for sharing that. And I would say that your experience is really similar to what happens in institutions across the board. So you're running up against that barrier of time poor academics in particular. And I would say in a setting like yours, where you possibly have a higher number of sessional teachers, for example, or people who have a high teaching load, that imperative becomes even stronger. So within FED at least, we have some recognition of scholarly teaching. So recognition that there is value in developing your teaching practices and enabling better access, but what you're saying is really familiar to us too. And in fact, as part of the PD program, I didn't mention it, but we are looking at barriers to adoption, and it's a really, what you've said is very familiar to me. And I guess that's where that point here in these studies, this is really looking at how you can actually try and overcome some of these things. And probably the more important component of this is actually the transformational strategies rather than the ameliorative strategies. I think where a lot of us already have the ameliorative strategies in place, providing bursaries, running workshops, but to really, to really change the way practice occurs does take much more an institution-wide approach, hence the need for the advocacy. So the advocacy is really looking at it from a much higher and wider level. But it sounds like what you're doing is great, and it's reflective of practice out there generally. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks.
Jenny, no worries. Thank you. Jenny, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just was asking, Marion, because we don't actually have lecturers on subjects like MIT. I'm just wondering, can the librarians get more part of the Federation, how it's working, and getting involved in it as well, so we can make sure our lecturers that part of the Federation is doing the right thing?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one, Jenny. I think when your teachers aren't actually developing their curriculum, I think one of the things that they can do is, if they're aware of the impact on students of, say, setting textbooks, and I know from working with partners over a long period of time, just like our own directly enrolled students, there is a reluctance often to purchase a textbook because, the international students in particular, they're paying a lot of money to both study and also to be in the country. So it is a barrier, and so I guess there would be that need to pass that sort of feedback on. How many students aren't buying textbooks, what the options are. So I think awareness raising, definitely. And I think through the role that Alison is about to commence, I think that there is value in connecting you in with the sphere of activity that is happening within Federation Library as well. We are still pretty emerging, I would say, like we're similar to Luke at this stage, but as we develop our practice, I can definitely see the benefits in involving partner library staff, because it's really, from our perspective, it's about improving the student experience. And Luke, you touched on moving away from the textbook to a range of curriculum resources that are being managed through the online copyright manager. That at least is a better quality of curriculum development than just setting a textbook, which we regard as kind of as pretty basic and a bit lazy in terms of exposing students to a range of sources. So that's at least a step up. And then if they can build some OERs into that as well, then that's great. And probably the other thing I would say was that with the Core Collective, all of these institutions will be creating textbooks that are for the Australian academic environment, and they're trying to focus on the areas of greatest need. So, you know, give it a year or two and there'll start to be much more of an influx of textbooks available for the market as well. So we'll be able to keep you posted with all of those developments too.
I also found here, Marion.
Just noticed the time. Sorry, it's
Yes,
3:01.
that's okay. Just a quick one. I also one of the I found here too that a lot of students don't like to use a textbook that they've been told to use Google and just cut and paste.
Oh no, yeah, it's awful. Yep. And so at least if you're using open resources, you know, I guess there's downsides in the sense that it does say things are open, but that's where I guess the licensing is really important, just that acknowledgement that there are restrictions around use, but directing students to quality curriculum resources that aren't just the textbook does help them learn the options that are available and that they can use in their own assessment tasks. So yeah, and then yeah, like I said, going into the open pedagogy, but most institutions aren't at the open pedagogy stage yet. So look, I'll stop sharing my screen and just turn my camera on just quickly. And look, I'm sorry that we've run out of time, but I hope that that was useful. And if you do have any questions after the session, please just let me know. But please check out the links that Luke posted, so both to that research report and to the MIT OER guide, and just do some Googling for yourself as well. I'll also load the slides up when I load onto the Moodle shell so that you can connect to some of the links that I've included in the slides if you want to do some more research for yourself as well. And if there's nothing else, I guess I'll let everybody go.
Thank
That
you,
was
Marion.
fantastic. Thanks, Marion.
Thank you. That was
Oh, you're welcome.
fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you soon. Introducing
Bye.
Alison to you soon. Thanks all.
Okay,
See you then.
bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a lovely
Bye.
day. Bye.
You too. Thank you. Bye.